I think our today, compared to the program we had yesterday and the lectures we had yesterday, I think we will move a little bit away from First World War, I'm afraid. As of course there are some links between the Nuremberg trials and basically the roots of the Nuremberg trials and the establishment and evolution of international criminal law as it was practiced in Nuremberg. So there are some roots going back to the time after First World War and the ideas of how mainly at that time war crimes could be prosecuted and how could people responsible for committing war crimes after during the First World War could be put on trial. I'll say a little bit more about that later on. I would just like to start with a brief introduction into actually what the Memorium is and what how the situation actually in Nuremberg is, because we already had a lecture yesterday about the Documentation Center Nazi Party Rally Grounds, which is the older institution, so to speak. It was founded in 2001 in the remains of the former Congress Hall of the Nazi Party, on the Nazi Party Rally Grounds, so the place where the Nazis held their big propaganda events between 1933 and 1938. And Nuremberg is a city that is basically, the name of the city of Nuremberg is linked to Nazi history in several ways. So it is the city, or it was the city of the Nazi Party rallies. It is the city that gave its name to the racial laws that were proclaimed in 1935 during the Nazi Party rally of freedom, the Rally of Freedom in 1935. So the Nuremberg laws, the racial laws proclaimed there. And it is, of course, the city of the Nuremberg trials. That has been mentioned for a long, long time, not only outside of Nuremberg and not only internationally, but even within the city of Nuremberg. These three aspects, so rallies, racial laws and Nuremberg trials, have been mentioned for a long time in one sentence, as if this would all have been the same thing, which is of course not the case, because the Nuremberg trials were more or less like the opposite of it, because they were the attempt of overcoming and reacting by law on these committed crimes. So that is actually, to be honest, I'm not from Nuremberg originally, so but I've been living there now for 15 years. So that was a bit surprising for me at the beginning when I started to work there. And I think that has definitely, this image definitely has changed, but still it is a place, the place where the trials were held and where the Memorium is located since November 2010, that's when we opened, is still a place that's very much, they're very much considered as a Nazi place, venue. So the Memorium is, as the documentation center, is part of the association of the municipal museums of Nuremberg. So we have two main departments. One department is the department that's mainly covering the history of the city of Nuremberg, cultural museums, etc. And the other section, the other department, is what actually Florian and I are belonging to, the department for contemporary history and remembrance. So this is actually the place where the Memorium is situated, and the Memorium is situated where the trials took place. So this is the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, which is located at the western end of the city. And you see a photograph. This was taken in August 1945, when actually there were the debates going on where the trial should be held. So this is the Palace of Justice in 1945. This is it. Actually, to be honest, it's not today, because some things have changed over here, but the Palace of Justice is still looks exactly the same as you see it here on this photograph. And so all this, actually, the whole building here, all the red roofs basically, you see, that's all the Palace of Justice. An important aspect certainly is that right behind the Palace of Justice there's the Nuremberg prison located. So you see this star-shaped building over there, which was taken away in the early 1980s, but still this is all Nuremberg prison, so it's all located next to each other. Actually, the decision why Nuremberg was chosen as the place for the International Military Tribunal is, again, it's a lot of people more like automatically think that the reason must have been a symbolic reason, so racial laws, etc. In fact, we do not know any official document mentioning this symbolic reason. It is mainly, first, the way to Nuremberg as a location was started actually in Berlin with the negotiations between the Allied powers. So both the Soviet Union as well as the Americans were more or less like secure the trial would be, of course, be held in their occupation zone. So they needed to find a political agreement. That agreement was that the permanent seat of this tribunal should be based in Berlin, and the first trial should be held in the American zone. And then the Americans were in charge of finding a place. Just imagine the situation in summer 1945 in Germany. So not so many huge buildings remaining. So it was pretty a challenge to find a place where they could hold these trials. And so they ended up in Nuremberg because, as you see, the Palace of Justice had survived more or less undestroyed. So in a pretty good shape. And another very important aspect was the logistics. Security, mainly security. As I just said, the prison right behind the Palace of Justice, so short ways, short distances, easy to bring over defendants to the court. The courtroom itself is located in this small building, which is a little bit separated from the main building. It's the jury court building. We do not have jury courts anymore in Germany since 1924. They were abolished in 1924. But they are, when the Palace of Justice was opened in 1916, they were still there. So this became the jury court building. And these 4 windows here, they are the windows of courtroom 600. So the place where the trial took place. I should maybe say a few words about, because I'm sometimes talking about the IMT, sometimes I'm talking about Nuremberg trials, the Nuremberg trial. So I think it's important to clear this up a little bit. When we talk about the Nuremberg trials, so the plural, we are actually talking about 2 different types of trials. We're talking about what is actually well known all over the world as the Nuremberg trial, the International Military Tribunal, held by the 4 main allies of Second World War, and held against the highest representatives of the Nazi regime. So that's the International Tribunal. When we talk about the plural and total, we are also talking about 12 so-called subsequent trials held only before American military tribunals. American for that reason, because Nuremberg was in the American occupation zone and therefore the Americans were in charge of that area. So in total we are talking about 13 trials that were held between November 1945 with the opening of the IMT, the International Military Tribunal, and ended in April 1949 with the judgment in the so-called Ministries case. So 1 international tribunal by 4 allies, 12 trials following from December 46 to April 49 before American military tribunals. All these trials were held in courtroom 600. So it certainly is like the core not only of the trials, but of course also of the Memorium as an institution. So, but what you definitely can tell from these photographs is that a lot of things have changed. So this is the courtroom of the trials. This is the courtroom today. So it looks slightly different. One aspect you cannot really tell from this photograph is that it was tremendously enlarged. It was much bigger for the Nuremberg trials, and also the setting in the courtroom had changed. So today you find the judges' bench just at the front of the room. Here you see it on the right-hand side, so it was turned by 90 degrees and was located there in front of the windows. Well, actually, basically the defendants were at the same place where they are today. So it was like the defendants, it was the defense lawyers, judges, stenographers, etc. So court staff. Over there in the corner, that was were the interpreters. Also, Nuremberg is considered as, was a novelty in many, many ways, of course in legal ways, but also in very practical ways, as it is also the place of birth for simultaneous interpreting, for example. Another novelty is the use of film as evidence. So there was a huge screen at the end of the hall, of the room, where they showed the Allies showed film footage mainly from the liberation of the camps, for example, propaganda material from the Nazis that were used as evidence during the trials. These tables here were the tables for the prosecution. So each of the main allies of Second World War actually sent one judge, one alternate judge, and each one a prosecution team, including a chief prosecutor to Nuremberg. So that's why we have actually 4 parties, so to speak, in the courtroom. I think what is important to consider in regards to Nuremberg is, or what this courtroom actually stands for, it is considered today, I will say something about that right after, in a few minutes, it is considered as the cradle of international criminal law today. In some ways it's true, in others it might not be so true, but that's the general image, the general symbolism actually the courtroom is linked to. It is definitely a symbol for the Allied victory. That's something that we can definitely tell from our visitors, because between 75 to 80% of our visitors aren't German. They are coming from all over the world. So we are definitely also, compared to some other presentations we had yesterday, the Memorium and this historic venue definitely isn't a venue that is linked to local communities. It's a venue that's very much, so our audience is mainly tourists from all over the world. So I think that's just a completely different setting. Of course, we are offering a lot of educational work, and this educational work, of course, is focused on local communities and mainly on German students, etc., classes, schools. But the majority of our visitors aren't local. So it is, and I think that's one of the reasons the Nuremberg trial is something that is very much linked not only to one national narration. It is actually part of a lot of narrations from many different countries all over the world. It was an truly international event that took place there. And that is something that is definitely, I would say, something very specific about this venue. It is also something, the courtroom and the trials are also something I definitely would say that are symbolizing the meaning of and the power of the rule of law. And compared to that, or related to that, I think it's important to see, to have in mind the aspect that Nuremberg actually stands to these stands for two different aspects of law. Law is not a fixed, static thing. Law is a very fluid, vulnerable thing. And Nuremberg, as the city of the racial laws, stands for oppressive law, with a very strong link to the oppressive use or abuse of law. It also stands for the opposite, like supportive law, as the Nuremberg trials. So I think that's something that's very specific also about the city of Nuremberg and the, how should I say that, the culture of remembrance that we are practicing in Nuremberg. As I said, Nuremberg is considered as the birthplace for international criminal law. That is actually, these were the counts of indictment in Nuremberg at the IMT. So the first, or actually I should start with the second one. The counts of indictment, so the material law of Nuremberg was, the definition of the material law was made during the London Conference. So it was proclaimed or announced or fixed, however, in the London Agreement on the 8th August 1945. In the London Agreement, which includes the charter of the IMT, you will find 3 counts of indictment, not 4. So the first one is crimes against peace, which was a count of indictment that was mainly based on multi-bilateral treaties mainly after the First World War. For example, the very important one, Briand-Kellogg Treaty. It was war crimes, probably the best defined count of indictment during the Nuremberg trial, because there had been so many other legal attempts, so to speak, to codify in humanitarian law. So it's the Geneva Conventions, it's the Hague, how they are called in English, the Hague conferences, and so on, Hager Landkriegsordnung. So a lot of definition had already been made, and of course, as a result of the First World War, there had been a lot of attempts, especially in the 1920s, to codify humanitarian law. So like the Briand-Kellogg Treaty, but also if you think of what became a crucial aspect, a crucial legal aspect during the Nuremberg trials, if you think of the additional parts of the Geneva Convention in regards to prisoners of war, etc. These all were aspects that actually were a result of First World War, and then laid the foundation, so to speak, for what then became the new law. But it was the first time it was successfully practiced in Nuremberg, especially in regards to war crimes, but it was not like the idea only came up in Nuremberg or only came up after Second World War. Crimes against humanity is the count of indictment that is mainly, that hides also, I really would say, hides a little bit the crimes of the Holocaust and the genocide. It was developed. A lot of critics against this count of indictment came actually through the legal rule that measures should not have retroactive effects. So, because there hadn't been before the Nazi regime, or before 1945, there hadn't been any law saying you are not supposed to commit a genocide. So it is something. There was a lot of debate about it in regards to the law of nature, natural law. How is it in English? Hugo Grotius, etc. So actually saying. You don't have to write down for a human being, or say it the other way. Every single human being has its own sense of what's right and not right, what's injustice, what's a crime. So if you kill another human being, you know it is a crime, even though no one maybe just wrote it down for you on a piece of paper as a codified law, for example. So. In between the London Conference and the opening of the IMT in November 1945, they added a 4th count of indictment, and that was conspiracy. Conspiracy was a count of indictment that mainly was developed by, mainly Anglo-British law, and that was used for the prosecution of piracy, for example. And the idea was you cannot be on a pirate's vessel and saying, I'm not a pirate. You cannot be a member of this government and say, well, but I don't have anything to do with the crimes. So that's a very basic explanation of it, but that's actually how they brought this into the trial, because let's say it pretty clearly, they were a little bit afraid. Some of them were afraid they might not get all of the defendants, in a sense of having their direct individual link and responsibility, or involvement, not responsibility, but involvement in the committed crimes. So that's why I said in the beginning, Nuremberg is considered as this new international criminal law. It was the first time that representatives of a state were held accountable for crimes that had been committed in their name or by their orders. following their orders. It was the first time that that an international tribunal in such a form was set up. So it's definitely a new thing that happened in Nuremberg, but it's not in a way that it appeared from nowhere. So there had been ideas earlier already. So as I already said, the defendants were, so this is probably one of the best known photographs of the trial. So the defendants in the dock in courtroom 600 in 2 rows, and you see the guards standing behind them. Everything that you see in the courtroom today, or most of it, all the furniture at least, comes from the 1960s. So when we look to the courtroom today, it's, for example, not the original dock. So what we have, actually, we only know of 2 original pieces of the furniture during the trials, and that are these 2 benches in the dock. So, and they're up in our exhibition. So our exhibition is located, I totally forgot to say that in the beginning, is located in the jury court building, but in the attic. So I showed you the windows of courtroom 600. So that's on the 2nd floor, and in the attic is our exhibition currently. So this is, and that's why you also, you see like there is the roof coming in and so on. So this is how the dock and how the defendants are presented in the exhibition. And as I said earlier, most of our exhibition is not about the defendants. It is, of course, we need to explain the crimes in some way. Then there is a need to explain why this trial happened, of course. It is, of course, important to have the defendants and to explain their involvement, their responsibility, who they were, etc., how they were chosen. But they are not playing the most important role, so to speak. They are one part of a trial which was mainly carried out by others. To just thinking of how active the defendants were in the trial, most of the time they were just, well, let's say that they were just sitting in the corner. So it was about them, but it was not them being the most active, playing the most active role, so to speak, because on their behalf it were, of course, the defense lawyers who became active during the proceedings. So this is just to give you an overview of how the exhibition looks, what the exhibition looks like. We have 3 main sections in our exhibition. The first one is dealing with the roots of international criminal law and of the Nuremberg trials. It's explaining the course of the trial, of the IMT, and of course explaining the judgment, the sentences, the executions that were carried out after 2 weeks after the final judgment, etc. So it's more or less, in this first part, is very much the explanation of the historic event from different angles, different perspectives, but it is very much like explaining, so this is the historical place of the historical venue of the Nuremberg trials, and this is what happened here. Just to, this is a model of courtroom 600 we are having in our exhibition, and you see these windows. So these are the chandeliers of courtroom 600. You can see through the windows there. So that's how we try to put up a direct linked to the historical venue. Unfortunately, courtroom 600 so far is still in use. It's still an active courtroom. So, and in Germany, it's not allowed to take any recordings, photographs, etc. from trial court proceedings. So these windows are totally, that's like 3 layers of windows. So they have to be totally shut and closed to make it impossible to have any interaction between the courtroom and the exhibition during trial proceedings. The second section of the exhibition is about the Nuremberg military tribunals, so these subsequent trials, so these trials held before American military tribunals. So this is just like a brief, to give you a brief insight into the exhibition. So this is, for example, this is a chart, an overview of these 12 trials and their defendants. And as you can imagine, it is pretty,
how should I say it? It's challenging because from the outside, just think of the defendant sitting in the dock. You always have the same image. It's always looking exactly the same. So it's not that easy to put it on display and for visitors to understand, okay, we have 24, originally planned to be 24 defendants in the first case in the International Military Tribunal, and then we're going through another 185 defendants in the exhibition. That's basically that's impossible, just from the way how to tell the story. So we actually, what we did is we have an overview, and then we are highlighting some of these trials, because some of them can be seen as some sort of model for different types of groups that were put on trial, because the subsequent trials were trials that made a very systematic investigation against the functional elites of the NS state, and they give a pretty clear image of the structure of the NS state, and that's certainly one of the huge benefits or merits of these trials. So we took out some of these, we selected some of these groups and explained it a little bit more into detail. This third section of our exhibition is about the legacy of the Nuremberg trials, which means international criminal law and international criminal justice today. That's something, when we talk about the legacy, when we think about the legacy of the Nuremberg trial or the trials, it is, most people think of the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which was founded by the Rome Conference in 1998, and in fact started its work in 2003 when there had been enough states who had ratified the Rome Statute, the Rome Charter. So of course it is the ICC, and the ICC is very much still until today referring to Nuremberg as, or the ICC saying they are actually fulfilling the promise of Nuremberg, as they are calling it, because in Nuremberg a lot of you will find it in some of the plaidoyers. You will find it in a lot of material documents around the International Military Tribunal, always saying, okay, we set up this International Criminal Court for this particular case, so the Nazi case, so to speak. But there has to be a permanent court established for the future. So because that would be the only way to prevent such crimes for the future. And that's why the ICC, as a permanent institution, is very much referring to this promise of Nuremberg. In fact, it is the first international criminal tribunals that were able to be established after the end of the Cold War, were the ICTY, former Yugoslavia, in 1993, and it was the ICTR in 1994 for Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda. And actually, especially the ICTY is a good example for really questioning the real deterrent effect of such tribunals. Because if you think of this tribunal being established in 1993, and if you think of what is the best known massacre of this period, of that war, it's Srebrenica, certainly, that occurred in summer 1995. So the tribunal had already been there. It was clear that the international community had already explained, we're gonna put you on trial for such atrocities, and nevertheless it happened. So it's a question, there are also other aspects of that, but it's certainly a question, does international criminal law really have such a strong deterrent effect or not? So that's, for example, this is from our third part in the exhibition, just to explain it briefly. So this is like coffins from Srebrenica, for example, as pictures. Most of the victims of Srebrenica were only be able to identify through DNA analysis. So these are, for example, some of these coffins where they did this DNA This is, for example, a picture in our exhibition that is, it's a demonstration, and you hardly see it from where you're sitting. So their names are listed on these papers, and there it's a list of the victims of the massacre of Srebrenica. So forget the Kosovo thing in the background. That's not what this picture actually is about. And this, for example, is victims of a massacre outside of a church in Rwanda from May 1994. Also, I think a pretty well-known picture. It has been in media through all over the world. So it is today, I would say, the main work in international criminal justice at the moment is done by hybrid tribunals, which is not ad hoc tribunals as the ICTY and the ICTR. It is not the permanent International Criminal Court in The Hague. It is hybrid tribunals because they are much more effective. So it's, for example, like the Kosovo tribunal that was just opened beginning this year, earlier in January, I think January this year. It is things like Cambodia, Sierra Leone. All these were hybrid tribunals. The big advantage of hybrid tribunals is that they're based on national jurisdiction, which has two effects. One thing, it's cheaper, and the other thing is they don't face that strongly as other international tribunals coming mainly from the UN. They don't face this critics of victors' justice that strongly, because they're much more integrated into the national system of jurisdiction. On the right-hand side here, this blue panel is something that we got into our exhibition. It was planned to be only as a temporary thing. It was on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the International Criminal Court, but it turned out that, especially for our educational work, a lot of our of the staff doing the educational work, they really liked it so much. They said that it's so good to work with these pictures. It's, for example, it's again hard to see. This picture is a picture of a woman. To be honest, I don't know exactly at the moment where she's from, and she has her nose cut off. So it's a pretty, on one hand side, it's a photograph symbolizing or showing a lot of cruelty, but also you can tell, I mean, she's laughing, smiling, and it's the combination of it's actually a pretty powerful picture for our work, because of course, for our educational work, because it is, a lot of people see it as a picture that shows the effect of reconciliation. So that's how they basically use it in the educational work. About the use of 3D, three-dimensional items in our exhibition. One of the, because the title of my presentation was how to put on display law. The main problem is law is hardly ever expressed in significant material values. So that's one of the biggest challenges we are facing. At the moment, our exhibition is using just a very, very small number of items, of three-dimensional items. We are using mainly, well, besides text and photographs, etc., we are using a lot of audiovisual material, and that works pretty well, but we are facing a huge transition project. The whole exhibition will be enlarged in the future. We will do a complete redesign within the next, let's say, Florian, 3 years, I don't know, let's see. We want to bring in more three-dimensional objects, but it's pretty difficult, I honestly have to say, to find objects that fit our criteria, which would be things like, it's of course the significance of objects, it's a question of material, it's the different, that's a huge thing, it's the different intentions and goals of archives and collections, because trial documentations are usually rather subject to state archives than to other to like museum collections. And they have completely different ideas of what would be worth to collect and to keep. It's of course the question of access, as we are not only dealing with historical content, but also contemporary, or I mean, again, a question, what's contemporary and how long is it contemporary? But with contemporary materials, and that may be limited to due to classified documents and all these things. So that's also, it's a pretty powerful challenge, let's say it that way. Before I end, I just want to say a few words about the use or how we actually deal with violent content in our exhibition. So what you see here is, just to explain it, this is one of the displays I mentioned earlier. It's highlighting one of the subsequent trials. In this case, it's the doctor's trial. And important in regards to the relation to Nazi history and in relation to also violent content, actually, is what we do, what our exhibition does, is not reflecting the crimes, but it's reflecting the reflection. So it's a second level, which also means that violent content comes in a more hidden way, maybe, into our exhibition. So it's not the crime itself, but it's the results and for example, the use of as evidence. So again, unfortunately, you cannot really see it. This is a photograph. This was one of the medical experts, Leo Alexander, who actually he testifies in the courtroom at the doctor's trial, a doctor's case against about medical experiments with prisoners, and he is showing the injuries on the backside of the legs of a former female prisoner at the concentration camp in Ravensbrück. We have these photographs used as evidence on the top there, which is like these ice water experiments that were carried out at the concentration camp in Dachau. These were shrunken heads of prisoners. They were used as evidence, as material evidence during the trial. What also appears, for example, is, and of course that's also violent content. This is the execution of a sentenced defendant from the subsequent trials. They were carried out in, Landsberg, where the American war criminals prison was located. And this is on a screen in our exhibition, but it is as a very brief, a very short part of a newsreel about the doctor. I think in this case, I think it was the doctor's trial. So it is, again, it's very much hidden. So we have a panel about the media, documentation reporters writing from Nuremberg. Then you have original newsreels, and then in the newsreel you have this short part. So it's hidden, but it is of course still there. And for example, this screen with the shrunken head. It's something that was one of the films of evidence. It's a 60 minutes film, only containing violent content basically. So what we did, for example, that's why I took this photograph. This is from below. It's one of these screens where you can only see it if you're old enough, which means you're like big enough to have a straight view onto the screen. If you're a child and you look from below, you see this. So that's how we try to get it a little bit more controlled. In general, in Germany, I would say we have some sort of a policy of not. Also our educational work to start it only at about the age of 12, maybe, not earlier in regards to Nazi history. So the museums, if you would ask someone at what age should you bring your children to a concentration camp memorial site, you would certainly probably not get the answer, well, we recommend to go there with small children. Of course, in the end, it's a decision by the parents. I think for the future in our exhibition, we might be able
to lower this age policy, because in our case, I think it's a different thing. It's not, as I said, it's a reflection of the reflection. So we are actually, I think it's easier for us to create content that is much more accessible also for young children. On the other hand, it is a very complicated and complex topic. So I think I'm done with the time. So I wanted to say a few words about our educational work, but basically I brought some of the brochures, so maybe I just don't do this right now. And for those of you who are interested in particular in what we are doing in our educational work, it's the English program, so please feel free to have a look. Thanks.